What's an adventure without a little excitement, eh? Sometimes you have to throw caution to the wind, or you'll never succeed at anything. So, when you delved into the dungeon with you and your party, and you came across that glowing magical symbol on the floor, it reasoned well enough that your more intelligent members of your group would pour together and try to puzzle out its purpose. Unfortunately, they failed. So, perhaps you drew lots. Or perhaps you just wanted to be the first to try something new. For whatever purpose, you were the one who first reached with some trepidation into the circle and touched the symbol. All of a sudden, the room spun around you. The faces of your friends became a blur. All thought, all chance of crying out, died in your throat as you were whisked away by magic and deposited unceremoniously into the Lair of OmnusI. Good evening. Welcome to the Lair of OmnusI. I am OmnusI, your humble host, Game Master at Large, and your guide through all things gaming related. We've had our fun through 7 levels of the dungeon already, and now we are here at the threshold of level 8. This level you may not find to be quite as taxing as some of the others that we've already gone over. Instead, I thought it would be useful in this space to appreciate those things that we have around us. This upcoming week, of course, we in America celebrate our Thanksgiving Day, where we count our blessings for all the things that life has given to us. And if we have the luxury of time and resources to enjoy role-playing games, we are truly fortunate indeed. Unfortunately, the gaming community is oftentimes fractious and split. And unfortunately, the recent political debacle that has gone on is still being felt to this day and causing rifts within the gaming community again. So it is to that I would like to just say that the Lair of OmnusI is a safe haven free of politics. I don't want to discuss politics. I really don't want to hear anyone discussing politics from the real world. However, there will be a time where here in the Lair we discuss politics in the fantasy worlds of your creations. That is not this episode, however. In this, I would also like for this level to be about illuminating another division that exists between gamers, and that is the preferences for the playstyle certain gamers have. And unfortunately, those who belong to either camp can sometimes be rather dismissive about those who enjoy other playstyles. So we're going to look at that today. Primarily, we're going to be looking at old school gaming versus modern narrative storytelling. Now, as long as gaming has existed, there have been people who have attempted to change certain facets of various games to appeal to them. using their imaginations, using their experiences to guide their efforts. Even chess has many, many variants. Checkers has plenty. There are certain house rules that people use for games like Monopoly and Risk. Certainly, house rules are something that a person can use to alter the flow of games that they enjoy. However, the very nature of role-playing games generally tends to lend to different styles. And the experiences those people have in those varying styles of games can lead to quite different experiences. For example, and we're going to go back to the very roots of gaming and what's considered old school games. When gaming first came out, one has to remember the influences that were felt most strongly upon them. Primarily board and war games. People have been, ever since wooden toys have been created, planned out battles in their imaginations or perhaps recreated battles from history. As more people got involved in these imaginary contests, rules were decided, and the people who are quite passionate about war games and wargaming sometimes do not flinch at having very, very large and very detailed units and collections for playing these games. Certainly all you have to do is look at the modern war games that are enjoyed today. Things like Warhammer 40K, but quite honestly, there are many, many war games out there. Warhammer brought in fantasy wargaming into my experience. Warhammer 40K certainly has shown me what science fiction and science fantasy bring to the table. And those are relative newcomers. There are people who've enjoyed games whose rules date back perhaps centuries. So, therefore, wargaming and board gaming inspired the imaginations and the passions of the forefathers of role-playing games. Now, I'm not going to delve into a history of these games, but one thing many of these systems had in common was that the characters that were used in these games were often relatively bare bones. People weren't as interested in all the different abilities that characters might have. If your character was a warrior, he could have just been a fighting man with a sword, a better armor than other characters, and perhaps able to take a bit more punishment than other characters, and that's about it. A wizard might have a handful of spells to cover them for a few different scenarios. And while those spells may have been very important in certain scenarios, they still relied on other characters, as wizards were frequently brought down to the level of other characters so that they wouldn't dominate these kind of games. Now, some of the standing features of these games was that they were primarily based around dungeon exploration. They still had very much the feel that there was an objective to be accomplished, and that by sending your adventurers down and challenging the dangers of the dungeon, you were overcoming a scenario, very much like you might do in a war game. The characters didn't need a great deal of detail because their deaths were relatively inconsequential. Many characters may have been written on 3x5 cards, for instance. Simply because the character died, you could simply tear it up and roll a new one very quickly. There are still people who enjoy this style of gameplay. Now, in those kind of games, it is possible to have role-playing. Those characters can grow and develop personalities, style, and every bit as much as any other game. However, death is relatively cheap. There's not a lot generally in old school games that keeps a player from death. No matter how experienced you get, you are one bad decision away from a messy death. Now there's several things that typify an old school rules experience. And that is, number one, the player is expected to bring all of their knowledge to bear to overcome the dangers that are in front of them. There isn't as much of a safety net in having preset rules like passive perception, where your character can just succeed at something without you coming up with a solution, or at least thinking enough to have a credible reason for your character to spot a hidden foe or detect a trap that may be before you. These games generally make you feel vulnerable and make the game a battle of wills between the game master, who creates the fiendish traps and designs and monsters that will be challenging the player characters, and the player characters themselves. Not so much the abilities of what the players can do, those certainly come to bear when there's a combat to be had and so forth, but the foresight of the players and them outsmarting the challenges is far more to the fore as far as importance goes. Now, these games still exist. Just because they were rooted in the 70s and 80s doesn't mean that they've faded or vanished. As a matter of fact, most of them are still digitally available. As far as a play style, it can be very eye-opening for somebody who's used to other styles to get into an old-school game. They may be somewhat spoiled by systems that encourage the survival of their characters, as several of the other playstyles do generally tend to be less lethal, preferring to keep your character alive for their own reasons. This does not mean the characters can't die in those games. However, death comes relatively cheaply in an old-school game. By design. Dungeons are supposed to be deadly. There is supposed to always be an element of danger, and you are far more likely to have a character die because of a certain circumstance, be it a trap, be it a bad decision that they made. That is just how it goes. Snowflake characters rarely have an opportunity to develop into, great and grand characters without the player being on their toes whenever those characters are exposed to danger. Another hallmark of those kind of games involves using every resource that you have, everything at your disposal, to give yourself a chance to succeed. Some of the earliest dungeons were delved by small groups or even a single player, but those players were smart enough, generally speaking, to go forth and hire some people to help them. Cuts into your profit a little bit, but if you survive, the rewards can be tremendous. Now, relying on forces outside of the player's control is something that is relatively exclusive to older school gaming. That's not always the case, but old school games almost require, unless you have a very large party of player characters, to have some sort of help to get through those kind of challenges. If nothing else, one of the tropes of having a torchbearer around. If your characters can't see in the dark, you need some way to see, and having a person to do nothing more than to hold a torch so that you can see and keep your hands free for fighting or casting spells or what have you can become a lifesaver. Every bit as much important as the good old-fashioned 10-foot pole. Speaking about the 10-foot pole, also, utilizing every facet of your gear was important for old school gaming. Using that 10-foot long pole, as ungainly and as silly as it may sound to a person who's not a dungeon delver, using it to prod the floor for traps, using it to hold a door shut by wedging it into the ground, using it to poke at something to see if there will be a reaction. For example, a dead body to see if it's undead, prodding it with your pole. Cutting your pole up into sections for various things, like posting into holes or cracks in the wall to make a crude ladder. These are outside of the box kind of things that never were really outlined in the books, that gives your players a chance to succeed, or at least increases their chances, certainly. So a lot of old school games basically count on the players using their knowledge and using all the resources at their disposal rather than using a bunch of gaudy abilities, flashy spells, and deep levels of magical gear to get them through the different challenges that they face. Now, if this sounds good to you, there's good news. There's an entire movement out there that follows old school rules, generally abbreviated OSR. I belong to several groups in Facebook that the members there all are very fond of the old school rules philosophy. Some of them to the point where they will actually turn their noses up at more modern games that coddle the players. And certainly that is a style that is not going anywhere. Still a lot of people who enjoy that type of gameplay. And I will admit, there is a rush of taking a relatively humble character and challenging somebody's sinister dungeon and overcoming it. Now, with that emphasis on challenging dungeons and such, that's not to say at any time that there's no role playing, that there's no kind of challenge outside of tactical room by room combats. That's not the case. Any role playing game has as much role playing as the game master and the players allow. It's just that there weren't a lot of social context rules and everything, but there are usually scenarios in many modules where the players get a chance to talk to people or may have to talk to people to get themselves out of a particular situation. And those rules are designed to be more free-form. They're there for role-playing, for the players to play as the characters, rather than just rolling a die and seeing how their diplomacy went. Some would say that's a purer form of role-playing. I'm on the fence. I see value in both styles. So, that covers old school rules. Obviously, it's a very deep subject, and if you like, you can look into those kind of rules. Things like Dungeon Crawl Classics, looking at any of the 0, 1st edition, even to some extent 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons rules, certainly cling closer to that spirit. There are a variety of knockoffs like Labyrinth Lords, Swords and Wizardry, including Swords and Wizardry Light, which was created by my friend Eric Tenkar. And there's just a legion of those kind of games. Now, developing from those, around the time of primarily the shift to 3rd edition, around 2000 plus, a lot of the focus in the greater body of gamers who went with the more mainstream games switched more towards a narrative style. And that is, it became more important to tell a story with the player characters than it was to constantly be challenging yourself against the brutality of an uncaring dungeon led by a sinister entity known as the Dungeon Master. Now, I'm not saying that Dungeons and Dragons, as Dungeons and Dragons went, so everything went. Obviously, there were many, many games that came out alongside of games like Dungeons and Dragons. For instance, Shadowrun had its first iterations, I believe, in mid-1980. And there are certainly rules in there that allow for the creation of player characters who can take enormous amounts of punishment, can be very difficult to kill. And you can tell a heck of a story with those kind of games. And there's so many that I can't really touch on all of them. Some that I'm fond of, though: Traveler, Shadowrun, many of the GURPS variants, Star Wars, West End's D6 system. There are a wide variety of games that let you tell different kinds of stories. Many of them, by default, have a preference for a certain style of play. Now, most of those ones that I just mentioned have mechanics in them that allow the player characters to have a better than even chance of surviving standard encounters. And even the boss fights, they have extra resources which give them a chance to stay in the fight and to overcome, or at least to get away intact so they can try again. They have a great deal of narrative built in, and generally you can tell how much narrative is built into a story by what is called fluff. That is everything in a book that is not rules based. That is the world, that is the setting. In some cases, that may be the very characters themselves and the description of how they fit into the world. The more important the narrative becomes to the story, the less ideal it is to have characters die frequently. It generally tends to cause the story to stop as hooks and things may be ripped out and have to have those characters replaced, as well as motivations and bits of the story that attach to those new characters. It can be a real trial. That's why in some of those games, some of the rules are written in so that characters have several gasps before they actually are killed. One of the more famous games of that variety, in my experience, is the Star Wars D6 system, created by West End Games. I and my players are quite fond of that. I have a large stack of those games on my shelf, and they were brilliant for telling stories in the Star Wars universe. I've got a lot of fond memories of games with that system. I have a lot of fond memories of running games for that system. That being the case, unless the character was woefully unoptimized for combat, it was very difficult to kill a character. The characters had several things protecting them. First of all, they had a connection to the Force. As the heroes of your story, the average mook stormtrooper just can't take down one of the heroes. It's unheard of. Even though there were mechanics that made them threats in large bunches, generally speaking, the player characters could drift combat to combat to combat without a great deal of fear that this was the big one. Now, obviously, you could set up challenges that really would be something that would imperil them. But on top of being able to connect to the Force and be a super character for a single combat round, and characters that could stockpile several of these so that their output could be incredible, you also had the ability to use the character points that you would normally use to progress your character. You could use those in a pinch, burn those off, and roll extra dice to get your bacon out of the fire. So with those different mechanics, characters didn't die very often in Star Wars in my experience. Not saying it couldn't happen, but it was fairly rare. Most players would prefer to burn their resources through rather than seeing a good character die off. And Star Wars was not the only system like that. The more games that came out with a more narrative-driven story, the change from old school gamings really started to become prevalent. No longer was it in fashion to make quick, easily disposable characters. Instead, those characters got more and more abilities, more and more ways of affecting the world around them, and more ways of doing cool things that might interest the players. Of course, with that, that also meant that a lot of those games were going to give tools to the game masters, suggesting how to set up a more narrative style. I seem to remember that when I was reading the Star Wars Game Master section, it said, a lot of the blueprints are already laid out for you. Think about a Star Wars movie. Think about the essentials. You have to have some sort of speeder chase. That's very important. Space fighter combat. There should be some element of that unless your players are completely opposed to those kind of things. There should be plenty of fighting. That's a keynote of those. They are adventure stories, so there's going to be threats. It doesn't always have to be stormtroopers, but sometimes if you're going to shake up the atmosphere, a good brawl can be a good way of doing it. And, there should always be action. There should always be the overlooming of the Empire, as those books were written before much of the stories that have come out after Episode 6. 1 through 3 and 7, of course, really weren't there so much except for the very tail end of the West End Games run with Star Wars. So a lot of the source books that you had really plowed in the original episodes 4 through 6. The main enemy was the Empire, and your characters were rebels. That's how that went. Later versions of Star Wars allow you to play in the a prequel era, where there's still a republic, or the post-rebellion era, where you have the new republic. And those are fine systems. I admit, haven't really played a lot of them, though. Still got my old games, my old systems, and I haven't run Star Wars as much lately. But, getting away from the point of this, generally a narrative story is going to have a lot of hooks into it that keep the players upright. They are going to have nifty abilities. They'll generally have things that allow the characters to know things that the players might not know. So the players' know-how and forethought may not be as important in these kind of games. It's a little bit different from having somebody jabber gobbledygook at you and then rolling a languages roll. That's something only the most hardcore old school rules fanatic would really have an issue with. But whenever you have things like a perception skill that allow you to see something that you didn't think to look for, but your character may have noticed because they're sharp even if you're not, well, that drifts away from the tactical excellence that old school rules try to draw out to allow your characters to get that kind of an advantage. So, where this ultimately leads to, beyond narrative-driven adventuring, is finally the ultimate, which is full participation. And that is something that is not new, but I've certainly become aware that more and more people seem to think this is a style that they prefer above the others. And those are the kind of games where player narration becomes almost a new law in the games. The players dictate exactly what happens to their characters, and then they roll to see if they can make what they say happen. I'm familiar with 2 games that are like that I'll use to illustrate as examples. In the game Exalted by White Wolf, your characters are, in the basic version of the game, godlings. They are extraordinarily powerful, able to warp the world around them with their special abilities, which is cool. I mean, it's definitely a fun and a challenging world. They have threats that are up to challenging godlings. It's very interesting. But when you are doing something as a godling, frequently you are narrating the circumstances and then rolling to see if those fall in line with what you say. A lot of the rulings are somewhat taken out of hand of the storyteller. The players are changing the world with what they say, and sometimes their assumptions become the reality that their characters dance around to. This can be very exciting for players who love to give that kind of detail. Now, even in old school rules, you could very easily add details here and there. But most of those details are going to be limited to what your character has. What I call control of reality out to the point of your sword. If you want to narrate that, instead of just I attack the ogre, instead I duck under the club of the ogre and swing at the back of his knee to try to take the beast low. That is, to me, more satisfying than saying I attack the ogre, number 1. But number 2, if you're going to play a game that increases player narrative as a resource for the experience, then that same thing of I lash forward attacking the ogre high and then cut low, spilling the ogre to the ground, and perhaps imposing that your attack was such that it would knock the ogre over, because that was something that you narrated. If you rolled well enough, you may be able to pull off that effect. Another game that uses this kind of storyline is called Fate, which is commonly, the core rules for Fate are free to download from the internet, and from there one could make almost any kind of game they could imagine. But there are a number of excellent world books out there that use the Fate system, and basically the same thing. The characters are created by the players. you determine, rather than having a predetermined list of skills and attributes, you determine what your character's skills are going to be. As long as they're within line of the storyline and the storyteller okays them, you're fine. This can lead to some very, very intricate and detailed experiences where the character can custom fit to make sure that their character fits into the story well. If you're playing, say, Dungeons and Dragons, and you have a very skilled thief or rogue, and you're brilliant at picking traps, that's your whole focus, and your adventure is into a castle that has no traps, a lot of your character's focus is kind of out the window. Something like Fate, the players get to dictate some of the aspects of the game so that they can ensure that their character will be able to, at least to some extent, be able to negotiate in that world and change things to their benefit. This can lead to characters who are more proactively engaged in the storyline. At least that's the hope of the game. If all the players are enjoying that kind of narrative style where they get to share in, it can probably lead to some pretty amazing gameplay. Now, I haven't used the Fate rules myself. I am currently working on a editing and advice in a book that uses that system, however, and there are some interesting things, some very exciting things about that rule system that it's interesting to see it all come together in the hands of a skilled writer. So, are any of these games better than any other? Not really. There's room in the great nation of gamers for all of these styles to exist alongside of each other. There is plenty of room for all of the types of gamers who are out there. From those who enjoy pitting themselves up against a harsh dungeon and hacking away at the monsters that come after them. Those who enjoy spiking doors to stop the monsters from coming after them with their pitons out of their backpacks, supplanted by the cheap hammers that they picked up. Or thinking of various ways of using their gear and really testing themselves against the environment. These people are just as welcome as somebody who picks up a gamebook for the first time and thinks that a fully narrative system like Fate is the one for them. That they want everybody to take a part in telling the story, not just have it narrated by one person and then everybody acting on what was narrated. Plenty of room. The only thing there isn't room for are people who are dismissive about other people's likes and dislikes. And sadly, there's far too much of that in the gaming nation. The more of that we curb, the sooner we can all get back to having fun in games. So, that's my take on these very different aspects of gaming. We'll delve into these a little bit more later on down the road. However, I just encourage, I entreat upon you, as you have your own viewpoints, as you are forming your own viewpoints of what you like, of what you've experienced, think about other people from their perspective. Role play out that person that you're being dismissive of in a post or perhaps in a convention setting. Instead of just rolling your eyes at this person who claims that they sunk water deep and therefore has a character that's of maximum level because they have so much experience, millions of experience from killing all these people, try to understand why that's their treasured memory. Try to understand what experiences led them to that point. Perhaps it's all they've ever known. Perhaps that fits their preferred style of play. And maybe, just maybe, you might find yourself some point at a crossroads, wondering what game I'm going to play now. And maybe you'll pick up that book that you never tried before and try a different style. And who knows, you might even like it. I'm not saying that all games are for everybody. Certainly, there are some games that will drive you crazy trying to understand the appeal. For all that I see the beauty of storytelling Fate, for instance, it's not a system that I choose to run. Even though I now have the rules and I've seen some of the rule books, it doesn't fit my style. I'm more of a narrative storyteller who enjoys creating the world around my players and letting them strive against my creations, my scenarios, more so than giving them a great deal of input into the world. My players are fine with that. I'm not holding them at ransom. They've been trained somewhat by me to my narrative style, and all willingly. And if they wish to contribute into the game, I try to take their perspectives into my general worldview and see if there's any chance that they can get what they're looking for. If it's access to a new class or a certain item that they're looking for, or some such. Generally, I try to work with my players as much as possible, but ultimately, as the game master, it ultimately falls down to what I'm willing to put into my game world. But that's just me. If you like a different style, by all means, play what you enjoy. That's what I hope for the rosy future for the gaming community. A lack of division over misunderstanding and acceptance of other people's styles and viewpoints and the other things that they bring to their game. So, with that, I think you've listened to me harangue on and on enough about fairness and being tolerant of other people. I think you've earned a bit of treasure. Hello, I'm the Nostalgia Gamer. I remember playing it so you don't have to. This is, of course, just an homage to the original Nostalgia Critic, Doug Walker. Very funny man, and I hope you don't mind me borrowing your look for just a moment. This is all just, of course, an homage, and I'm not going to be the nostalgic gamer, certainly. This is to, number one, show you one avenue of entertainment that I have used to inspire my gaming abilities. Certainly I have, while enjoying his works, I've also absorbed some of what he has put into his various movie criticisms, as far as knowing what kind of characters that people are enjoying these days. Of course, seeing some movies that dovetail nicely into gaming that I've enjoyed. And also, I'll admit it, he has surrounded himself with some very talented individuals, and you have a feeling that they're the kind of folk who go into a project and just, all of them just get into it, even if they perhaps individually may not feel like they're into it. You can't tell. They're always enthusiastic, and they're spot on with delivery and putting out a very good project. In a similar way, I work with my players and the other creative people around me, and I generally like to think that the product that I put out on my gaming table night after night generally tends to be fairly good stuff. So, thank you, Doug, for that, and if you have not followed the Nostalgia Critic, I highly recommend it. You can find them on channelawesome.com. Certainly a recommendation for entertainment, even if you never use them for gaming material. I highly recommend, firstly, his Dungeons & Dragons review is excellent. It's so funny, because, of course, the movie itself is funny. He doesn't have to do as much, but his observations and his criticism are spot on. The Batman and Robin episode is a personal favorite of mine, as it is for many of his fans, because he's so over the top and hilarious in it. The Bat credit card should not be a thing to be missed. So, again, this is my homage to Doug Walker, and this is probably the last time you will see this getup. The second part of this is to let you know that I am going to be opening up another channel for my own personal brand of criticism, which will be into role-playing games and materials. So for that, keep your eyes open. It's a new venture for me, and I'm not going to steal Doug's shtick. I've got my own, thank you very much. But I trust that I will, again, still keep getting inspiration to try to make it entertaining and useful for you, the consumers and viewers. So, that is the 8th level of my dungeon. I hope you found it engaging, and I hope you enjoyed it. For this, you definitely deserve 150 experience points. Well earned. And I would also say that you find a special golden coin mixed in with the others. It's about half again as large, but it's very, very thin, almost like a disc more than a coin. Funny thing about it, if you flip it, every single time, it'll always turn up heads. What use could that be? Who knows? Maybe sometime when you see me face to face, you might ask me, what use is a gold disc that always flips heads up? And we might have a fun story together. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for coming to the Lair of OmnusI. I appreciate all of my subscribers and viewers. So, thank you, and be ready. Next week will be a Lair of OmnusI. It may be a bit late, as Thanksgiving weekend is kind of a tough one for content providers to make new content. And for me, it's going to be rather tricky. But we'll see what we can do. Hopefully, we'll be able to entertain you again and get you ready for the holiday season with more Lairs of OmnusI. So, thank you, and safe adventures.